The first sign of trouble wasn't the riders on the ridge, it was the way the wind changed. One moment the air was still, the next it carried the faint smell of wood smoke that didn't belong to any camp Jacob knew. He reined in his team just as the trail bent around a rise of pale stone, and the view opened onto a ring of tall lodges with thin threads of smoke curling into the hard blue sky. Men moved slow and deliberate near the central fire. Women carried baskets from the drying racks. 3 young women stood apart watching him. They stayed close together, whispering behind their hands, their laughter carrying just far enough to reach him. He wasn't planning on stopping here, but the chief's voice left no choice. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever found yourself on a road you didn't mean to take. My name's Jacob Rohr, and for the past 10 years I've made my living hauling freight between small mining towns and remote army posts. I grew up on the southern plains where a man learned early that a good horse, a sharp eye, and a steady hand could make the difference between getting home or not at all. My father broke mules for the freight companies, and my mother kept a garden that could feed a family through a winter without a single trip to town. We didn't waste much, and we didn't talk more than was needed. But when a neighbor's roof blew off in a windstorm, you were there with a hammer before breakfast the next morning. I carried those habits into my years in the cavalry, riding ahead of patrols through ground that could turn on you in a heartbeat. Orders were orders, and you followed them until the day one came down that I couldn't see through. I left the service with nothing but my gear. My horses and the memory of a younger brother buried under a cedar tree after a fight neither of us believed in. Freight work suited me after that. It didn't ask for talk or trust, just that you show up when you said you would and keep the cargo whole. The run I was on should have been straightforward tools and flour to Red Mesa, then back with salt pork and lamp oil for a camp north of Fort Union. I'd made the delivery by mid-morning and turned east to shave a day off my return. At the fork, the lower trail was familiar, but washed out from rain. The upper cut was dry and firm, so I took it figuring the climb would be easier on the team than fighting ruts. It was quiet up there, only the creak of harness leather and the soft thud of hooves on rock. Then came that drift of wood smoke, and a moment later, the lodges. I eased the wagon to a stop well short of the nearest fire, both hands off the reins to show I meant no harm. 2 mounted men approached without a word, their eyes steady on me. The chief followed on foot, his hair streaked with gray, his shoulders broad as a barn door. He told me I would stay until sundown, safer here, he said, than on the trail. I stepped down from the bench boots, settling in the packed dirt, and felt the weight of the sisters' stares from across the way. One with a long braid tied in feathers, one with her hair loose and shining, and the youngest glancing at me with no mockery in her eyes. Behind them, the camp moved in its rhythm, but I could sense something beneath it, a readiness like a hand resting just above the grip of a rifle. The sun was high and the air was too still. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something was moving toward us. The wind carried that strange smoke a little longer before it thinned, leaving only the dry heat pressing down on the mesa. I kept my hands where the guards could see them, the reins loose across the wagon bench. Chief Elias's voice had been firm when he told me I'd remain until nightfall. It wasn't said as a warning, but there was a weight in it that made moving on feel like stepping into trouble blind. 2 young men led my team toward a hitch rail near a spring. I walked with them, the leather creaking under my hand as I loosened the cinches. The chestnuts lowered their heads to drink their flanks still damp from the climb. Across the open ground, Asha stood with her sisters near a rack of drying hides. Her braid caught bits of sunlight, and the small feathers tied along its length stirred in the faint breeze. Tula leaned close, speaking quick in their own tongue, a smirk pulling at her mouth. Naira glanced my way once, then dropped her gaze to the dust at her feet. When I checked the lashings on the crates in the wagon bed, Asha came closer. Her eyes moved from the tools on my belt to the rifle laid across the bench. "You were a soldier," she said, her English clear, though touched with an accent. I met her look. Once. She tilted her head slightly. You fight for your people, I fought where I was told. I answered, my tone even. Her gaze held mine a moment longer before she turned away, the fringe of her dress brushing against her leg as she rejoined her sisters. The camp had its rhythm, but there was a tension in the way the men kept glancing toward the eastern ridge. It was late afternoon when the stillness deepened. Birds went silent. I felt the faint vibration through the wagon wheels, saw the horses' ears turn toward the high ground. Figures appeared against the sky. One rider at first, then two more followed by several others, fanning out along the crest. 6 in all, sitting loose in their saddles, watching. Chief Elias stepped forward from the central fire, lifting his hand in a quiet signal. Men took positions without a word, 2 toward the brush line, 1 by the water trough, another near the gap between lodges. Women moved children inside their skirts, catching on lodge flaps. Those without rifles still carried whatever they could grip, a short spear, a hatchet, a stout pole. I pulled the carbine from the bench, feeling the smooth action under my thumb. One rider eased down from the ridge, angling toward the horses. I crossed the open ground to meet him, boots biting into the dirt. He swung down, a pistol in hand. I brought the butt of the carbine hard into his wrist. The gun dropped, skidding out of reach. That movement was all it took. Another raider fired the shot, kicking up dust near the drying racks. 2 of the camp's guards answered. One bullet struck a saddle horn, jolting its rider sideways. Gunfire cracked sharp in the dry air, the smell of powder drifting across the camp. I kept myself between the sisters and the fight shifting. When the line of threat moved, Asha crouched low, drawing Naira behind a stack of wood. Tula's knuckles were white on the shaft of her spear. 2 raiders broke off first, wheeling back toward the ridge. The others fired wild, retreating after them. Hoofbeats faded until only the heavy breathing of men and animals filled the space. When the chief lowered his hand, I eased the carbine down. Asha stood, dust clinging to her dress. She looked at me longer than she needed to. You didn't have to stand there, she said quietly. Yes, I did. There was nothing more to add. Around us, the camp began to breathe again. But eyes that had been cautious now carried something different. That evening, a fire was lit at the center. Men and women gathered in a half-circle, children seated at their mother's feet. I stood off to the side until 2 of the younger fighters motioned for me to join. Chief Elias's frame was broad in the firelight, the lines of his face deep in the flicker. This man came into our camp by mistake, he said, his voice carrying steady. When danger came, he stayed. He stood in front of bullets not meant for him. The chief's gaze shifted toward Asha, Tula, and Naira. When a man stands for us without blood ties, we give him a tie he cannot break. One of you will join with him by choice, with understanding. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Asha rose her step unhurried, the worn strap of her dress slipping slightly on her shoulder. She stopped close enough that I could see the dust smudge along her cheek from the fight. You didn't run when you could have, she said. That is enough for me. She turned to her uncle. If it is to be done, I choose him. A boy brought a cup of water and a strip of bread. Asha drank first, then passed it to me. I took a sip, broke the bread in half, and gave her the piece before keeping my own. It was done without ceremony, yet it carried its own weight. The night moved on with talk of mending bullet holes in lodge poles and setting a fresh watch. I took the first hours outside Asha's lodge, standing where the firelight faded into shadow. Once she came out barefoot to look at the stars. She didn't ask why I was there, and I didn't feel the need to explain. The land was quiet again, but the air still held that edge that comes when trouble has only been turned away, not gone. Dawn laid a pale light across the mesa. I led the chestnuts to water, checking their hooves for small stones. Asha crossed the open ground toward me, her hair loose down her back, a strip of leather in her hand. She spoke without pretense. You work early. Early's when the work gets done, I said. The camp had settled back into its pattern, but glances toward me were no longer from strangers. There was caution still, yet it came with a nod that said I'd earned a place at their fire, at least for now. Asha reached for one of the water skins hanging on the post. "We'll need more before midday." Her eyes flicked toward the narrow path to the spring. No one walked there alone after the night before. "I'll carry it," I told her. We went together, the sound of our steps over dry ground, the only noise. At the spring, she bent to fill the skins, her braid sliding over her shoulder. I took the first from her when it was full water running over my hands. "You been here before?" she asked. "Not here," I said. "Road scout for the army, went where I was told." She glanced up. "And did you like it?" I shook my head. "No. But it kept my men alive. My brother too, until it didn't." She didn't press for more. Back in camp, Tula sat repairing a saddle blanket, Naira sorting leather straps beside her. They both looked up as we returned, Tula with that faint smirk again. The rest of the morning was given to work. I scraped a splintered edge from a wagon wheel, Asha holding the rim steady. When I finished, she stayed close, her eyes searching my face. "Last night, when you moved toward the man with the pistol, you didn't look at the chief first." "Didn't have time to ask," I said. "If a man's pointing a gun waiting for permissions, a mistake." She nodded slightly. "My uncle saw that. He doesn't give his trust easily." "Neither do I," I answered. By midday, the heat pressed down. I stripped off my duster and worked with my sleeves rolled, sweat running at my temples. When a group of younger men passed, one lingered in his look toward Asha. Without thinking, I shifted to stand between them. She noticed her mouth curving in a small smile before turning back to her work. The hottest part of the day was quiet. Asha sat a few feet from me near the wagon, both of us working without need for words. It wasn't comfort yet, but it was steady. And for the first time since I'd come into the camp, I hadn't thought about leaving. The early morning light cast long shadows across the mesa as the camp stirred awake. The smoke from the lodges curled upward in slender threads, twisting against a pale sky. I moved quietly among the horses, checking their hooves and water troughs, the sound of their steady breathing mixing with soft voices calling from the tents. Asha came out, her hair loose, and catching the first sunlight, a leather strip in her hand as she began to braid it back. "You work early?" she said, her voice even, but without any teasing. I nodded, keeping my focus on the horses. Early is when the work gets done. The camp settled into its usual rhythm quickly after the night's tension. Men repaired a lodgepole near the center, women carried water from the spring, and children chased one another among the drying racks. I noticed some of the younger faces watching me, with a mixture of curiosity and cautious acceptance. Asha moved with purpose, fetching water skins and speaking quietly to her sisters. But there was no trace of the laughter from the day before. When she offered to carry water herself, I insisted on helping. The walk to the spring was silent, except for the sound of our boots stirring dust. She bent over the skin to fill it, the curve of her waist outlined by the sunlight braid sliding across her shoulder. "Have you been here before?" she asked. "Not this camp," I replied, "but I've passed through this land before riding scout for the army." She straightened, eyes steady. "Did you like it?" I shook my head. "No. It kept men alive, but I never liked it." Back at camp, Tula repaired a torn saddle blanket, Naira sorted through leather straps. They glanced up as Asha and I returned the quiet smirk, still tugging at Tula's lips. The rest of the morning passed with shared labor. I scraped splinters from a wagon wheel, Asha steadying it with careful hands. When I finished, she lingered near, her gaze searching mine. "Last night, when you moved toward the man with the pistol, you didn't look at the chief first," she said softly. "Didn't have time," I answered. "If a man's pointing a gun waiting is a mistake." Her eyes softened. "My uncle sees that. He trusts less than most." I nodded. "So do I." The afternoon heat pressed down, and I stripped off my duster, rolling up my sleeves. Sweat ran down my temples as younger men passed by, one pausing in a glance toward Asha. Without thinking, I shifted to stand between them. She caught the movement, a faint smile crossing her lips before she returned to her work. As the sun climbed higher, Asha and I found ourselves sitting near the wagon, working side by side in quiet. It wasn't comfort yet, but a steady presence, a slow pulling of the space between us. For the first time since arriving, I didn't think about leaving. Then the boys came running, breathless and wide-eyed. Dust clouded the far ridge more than wild stock, less than a slow herd. Riders coming our way. The camp stiffened instantly. Women pulled children inside the lodges. Men shifted to readiness. Without waiting, I stepped toward Chief Elias. "How far out?" I asked. "Less than an hour if they keep riding," one boy answered. The chief nodded, voice low but clear. "We move the horses. If they come for them, we meet them there." Asha stepped forward beside me. "My sisters ride with the string. I go too." The chief's eyes met hers before giving a single nod. "Stay behind him. Follow his lead." The trail to the grazing hollow wound between low rocky rises, dust stirred by our boots. The sun dropped, but heat clung to the stone. I kept my carbine ready, eyes flicking over every shadow. "You've done this before," Asha said quietly. "Too many times," I answered. "You just learn what to watch for." Ahead, the faint drag of a horse pulled in haste. Signs the riders were close. We moved quickly, gathering the horses into a tight group against the hollow's rocky walls. Asha stayed near, handing me rope, her movement steady despite the tension. At one moment, our hands brushed, reaching for the same halter, neither pulling back. The first rider appeared at the far end, followed by two more. They stopped, assessing us. I stepped forward, rifle low, but ready, speaking over my shoulder. "Hold your ground." The lead rider spurred closer, voice rough with challenge. "That's a lot of horses for a small camp," I answered, calm but firm. "Not yours to count." He smiled a sneer and spat into the dust. "Could be no one's by nightfall." Asha's hand tightened on the rope. The tension stretched before the leader pulled back, muttering it wasn't worth the trouble. The others followed, fading into the distance. As we walked back, Asha brushed her shoulder against mine. "You didn't have to stand in front like that." "Didn't think about it," I said. "Just did." "Do you think about it now?" she asked, eyes steady. "Yeah," I said. "And I'd do it again." Back at camp, word had already spread. The chief listened to the tale with a steady gaze. Asha and I tied horses, but when she glanced back, there was no laughter, only a quiet something that held steady between us. That night, she sat beside me by the wagon, close enough for shoulders to touch. No words were needed. The space between us had shifted again, less guarded, more certain. Morning broke cool and clear, but the calm carried an edge. Silence hung heavy, broken only by lodge smoke curling skyward and the soft stir of camp life. Chief Elias spoke with two scouts, just returned, their faces grave. "They're back," one said, "at the dry arroyo 2 miles east." The camp tensed. "They're waiting?" Asha said, eyes narrowing. "They won't just leave," the chief agreed. "They will test us again. Not today, maybe not tomorrow." I knew then the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The horses were the lifeline here. Losing them meant losing the camp's strength. "We can't keep the horses here," I told the chief. "They'll come at night, try to steal what they can." Asha stepped forward with a plan. "Then we move them again, but this time we stay with them." The chief nodded. "We'll keep to the low ground. I'll take the lead." With the horses moving, Asha walked beside me, sisters and men close behind. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smoke not from our fire. Shadows moved on the slopes. Riders emerged, pushing the herd toward a narrow pass. I barked orders, driving the horses through while firing to hold the attackers back. Asha stayed low, her bow ready, dust streaking her face. We made it through without losing a horse, but the tension didn't ease. One wrong step could have turned this into a fight we wouldn't walk away from. Standing beside me, Asha caught her breath and said, "You didn't leave my side. Was there anywhere else to be?" I asked. The unspoken weight of that moment settled between us as we returned to camp. The coming days would test us again, but for now the line between stranger and ally was growing thinner. The sun was barely over the ridge when I heard the first sounds of the camp stirring. A few low voices carried across the open ground, mixing with the soft creak of leather as men checked their tack. I was already up walking the perimeter out of habit, the air still cool against my face. The quiet seemed heavier than usual, as if the land itself was listening. When I came back toward the center, Chief Elias stood with 2 scouts. Both had dust on their trousers and the look of men who'd been riding hard. The older one gave a short nod in my direction before speaking to the chief. "They're back. Same men, maybe more. Camped near the dry arroyo 2 miles east." I stepped closer. "They're waiting for something," I said. The scout agreed, not moving fast, watching. Enough horses to carry whatever they take. Asha had been stacking firewood nearby. She straightened, eyes narrowing. "If they're watching, they're planning. They won't just leave." The chief's voice was steady. "They will test us again. Maybe not today, but soon." I looked toward the hitch line where the chestnut stood. "We can't keep the horses here. If they're that close, they'll come for them at night." Asha didn't wait for her uncle's answer. "Then we move them like before, but this time we stay with them." Elias gave one slow nod. "We keep to the low ground, no open ridges." Within the hour, we had the string moving out. Asha walked beside me, her sisters just behind with 2 of the guard line. The wind shifted once, carrying the faint scent of smoke that didn't belong to us. I kept my eyes moving, watching every rise and cut in the land. Halfway to the grazing hollow, movement flickered on the slope to our right, a rider easing down low in the saddle. Another appeared to the left, blocking the trail ahead. They were trying to push us into a choke point. "Get the horses between those rocks," I called, pointing to a narrow pass. Asha moved quickly, driving the leaders forward while Tula and Naira kept the others tight. 2 shots cracked in quick succession. One splintered a rock near my boot. The other startled a young horse into rearing. I fired back, the sound echoing off stone. One rider pulled up short, retreating to cover. The other slowed, eyeing my stance before wheeling away. Asha stayed low, guiding the last horses through the pass. I backed in after them, keeping my rifle ready until the hollow closed us in. The raiders didn't follow. They lingered at the edge of the slope, just visible against the sky, then pulled back. I watched them go, the tension still tight across my shoulders. When the last sound of hoofbeats faded, Asha came to stand beside me. Dust streaked her face, strands of hair loose from her braid. "You didn't leave my side," she said. "Wasn't going to," I answered. We stayed in the hollow until the sun began to drop, then brought the horses back under guard. The camp met us with watchful eyes, relief showing only in the small way, shoulders easing, voices returning to normal pitch. That night, Asha found me by the wagon. She sat close enough that our knees touched, her voice low. "When I chose you, I didn't know if you'd stay when it mattered. Now I know." I met her gaze. "Then you know I'm not going anywhere." Before sunrise, the raiders came again. The half-light made them little more than dark shapes against the ridge, but I'd been awake since the first glimmer of dawn. I saw them before the sentries called out. Chief Elias's orders moved quick through the camp, women and children inside the lodges, horses driven toward the inner pen fighters to their posts. I took my place at the pen gate. Asha stood to my left with her bow. Tula and Naira were at the flank, both armed and steady. This time the camp wasn't caught unready. Every person knew their place. 2 riders came hard from the south, thinking speed would break us. I waited until they were close enough to be a threat before firing, dropping one from the saddle. The second swung wide, only to be met by 2 of our young men, who sent him reeling back up the slope. Gunfire cracked across the open ground, the smell of powder sharp in the air. I moved where I was needed, shifting between cover and open space to block any path toward the horses. Asha stayed tight to my side, loosing arrows with quick precision. When a shot splintered the post near her head, I stepped in front and fired until the rider turned away. The fight didn't last long. The raiders had counted on fear and confusion, not a line that held. By the time the sun broke fully over the ridge, they were in retreat, leaving 2 men on the ground and a limping horse that would travel no farther. Silence settled in, broken only by the horses shifting in the pen and fighters checking on one another. No one had fallen. Chief Elias walked toward me, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. They will not come back. We've shown them this ground is not theirs to take. And we've shown that you, he said, meeting my eyes, are not just a man passing through. That evening, the camp gathered in quiet celebration. Meat roasted over open flames, bread baked on flat stones, was passed from hand to hand. Asha sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine as we shared a bowl. Tula teased her under her breath, Naira smiling whenever she caught me looking at her sister. When the fire burned lower and the stars spread overhead, Asha turned to me. You've given this place your word. What about me? I reached into my coat and pulled out the small silver ring I'd carried for years, set with a piece of turquoise worn smooth in my pocket. Walk with me as my wife. Her answer was simple. I will. Bread and water passed between us, the chief's hand resting on both our shoulders. By spring, the wagon stood near the edge of the camp, no longer hitched for the road. My work was here now, mending fences, tending horses, hunting when needed. Asha's sisters came often, the lodge filled with their voices. One warm afternoon, Asha took my hand and placed it on her belly. By winter, there will be 3 of us. My hand stayed there, the sound of the camp around us fading for a moment. For the first time in years, the road behind me felt like it had led exactly where it was meant to. The days after the last raid settled into a quieter pace, though the air still carried a trace of watchfulness. I spent the mornings repairing a stretch of fence that had come loose in the wind, the sound of the hammer carrying across the camp. Asha worked nearby, sifting grain for the horses, her sisters coming and going with bundles of dried meat and folded hides. It felt like the camp had found its rhythm again, but no one had forgotten how quickly it could break. By late afternoon, Chief Elias called me to walk with him beyond the lodge circle. The sun was lowering, casting long slants of light across the mesa. They may try again before the season turns, he said, as we followed a narrow path toward the ridge. Men who fail do not always leave for good. Sometimes they wait for you to be unready. His words weren't meant to stir fear, just to set my mind in the same place his was, ready for whatever came next. We reached a high point where the land opened wide. Below us, the grazing hollow lay quiet, the horses shifting lazily in the shade of low rock. You'll keep watch with my nephew tomorrow, Elias added. 2 sets of eyes see more than one. I nodded, knowing the stretch of land he meant was open enough to spot riders long before they closed the distance. The following morning, I rode out with his nephew Caleb, a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with a steady way of speaking. The leather of the saddle creaked under me as we moved over the ridge and down toward the hollow. Caleb pointed to a set of tracks in the dust, faint but fresh. Not ours, he said. We followed them a short way until they broke toward the east, then circled back to the horses. When we returned, Asha was waiting near the hitch rail. "Everything quiet?" she asked. "For now," I said, sliding down from the saddle. She handed me a water skin, her fingers brushing mine in the pass. "Good," she replied, her tone steady, but her eyes searching my face for anything I hadn't said. That evening, as the heat faded, I sat near the wagon sharpening my knife on a flat stone. Asha joined me with 2 bowls of stew, setting one at my side before taking her seat. "You think they'll come back?" she asked, not looking directly at me. "If they do, we'll be ready," I answered. She gave a small nod and looked toward the ridge where the sky was turning to a deep shade of violet. The next day brought a dry wind that tugged at the lodge covers and sent dust along the paths. I worked with 2 of the younger men to set a new hitch rail driving posts deep into the ground. By midday, sweat streaked my shirt and I stopped to draw water from the trough. Asha came by with a bundle of leather straps, pausing to watch as I tested the rail for strength. "It'll hold," I told her. She smiled faintly. "Good. We'll need it." Later that afternoon, a rider approached from the north, one of the scouts who kept to the outer trails. He carried himself with a sense of urgency, swinging down before the horse had fully stopped. "Smoke on the far side of the ridge," he said to Elias. "Not ours, and not from the trading road." The chief's expression tightened just enough for me to notice. Orders went out quickly. We would move a portion of the herd into the hollow before dusk, keeping them close through the night. I saddled up with Caleb again, Asha riding behind us on her own horse. The path was narrow and shadowed the sound of hooves muffled in the dust. When we reached the hollow, we set the herd in tight, using the natural rock walls as cover. Asha dismounted and came to stand beside me as I scanned the ridge. "Feels like the air before a storm," she murmured. I kept my eyes on the high ground. Storm or not, we'll keep them here. The light was going fast, shadows pooling in the cuts and folds of the land. Caleb moved along the perimeter, checking each entry point. We stayed through the night in turns, 2 watching while 1 rested. The coyotes called in the distance, and the wind shifted once to carry a scent of wood smoke stronger than before. It was nearly dawn when Caleb returned from the far edge of the hollow. "Saw movement," he said quietly. "Too far to mark, but it wasn't deer." We broke camp quickly, driving the herd back toward the lodge circle under a rising sun. No riders followed, but every glance toward the ridge felt heavier. Back in camp, Elias listened to Caleb's report without a word, then gave his orders to keep the guard doubled for the next 3 days. That evening, the camp moved slower. People spoke in low tones, the firelight catching on polished rifle barrels laid close at hand. Asha sat with me again near the wagon, her sisters close enough to listen, but not close enough to speak. She didn't ask about the ridge this time, and I didn't bring it up. We both knew it was only a matter of time before whatever we'd seen or thought we'd seen showed itself in full. The last of the firelight flickered against the side of the wagon, when a lone rider appeared on the far edge of camp, his silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. He didn't come closer right away, just sat his horse as if measuring the ground between us. The rider at the edge of camp stayed still for a long moment, the shape of him cut against the fading light. I rose from where I'd been sitting by the wagon, my rifle leaning just within reach. Chief Elias stepped forward first, his hand lifted in a slow, steady signal that I read as caution rather than welcome. The man nudged his horse ahead until the firelight caught his face, thin-weathered, the kind that looked carved by wind and years. He stopped a few yards short of the outer ring of lodges. "Got word from the south," he said, voice carrying without force. "Men asking about your herd, asking about the white freight driver in your camp." His eyes flicked toward me before returning to Elias. The chief's reply was even. "You rode far to bring this." The rider nodded once. "Figured you'd want to know before they got closer. They were at the trading post 3 days ago. Didn't hide what they meant to do." Elias told him he'd be given food and a place to bed down before he made the ride back in the morning. As the man dismounted, I caught Asha's eyes from across the fire. She was watching me, her expression calm, but intent. Later, when the camp had quieted, she came to where I was checking the horses' lines. "You believe him?" she asked. I checked the hitch knot before answering. His kind doesn't waste the miles unless there's truth in it. The next day was given to preparation. Fences were tightened, hitch rails reinforced, and the herd brought in close. Caleb and I checked the hollow twice before midday, scanning the ridge lines for movement. Asha and her sisters hauled water, the slosh of the skins and the low murmur of their voices carrying in the dry air. By evening, the camp was as ready as it could be, without knowing exactly when the threat would come. It was well past dark when the dogs started barking toward the east. I was on my feet before the first man reached the fire to sound the alarm. "Movement on the ridge," he said. "Not many, but moving like they mean to close in." Elias's orders were quick and clear. Men to the flanks, women and children into the lodges, horses inside the pen with guards at both gates. I took the north gate with Caleb. Asha came to stand near the corner post, her bow strung and ready. The moon threw just enough light to catch the shapes of riders easing down the slope. They kept to a slow walk until they were within 100 yards, then spread out in a loose arc. One called out something I couldn't make out the tone mocking. No one in the camp answered. They edged closer, and I could see the shine of metal in their hands. The first shot came from the far side, answered by a crack from one of our guards. The sound broke the standoff, and the riders surged forward. Caleb fired beside me, dropping one before he reached the fence. I swung toward the left, where two tried to break through together, sending one tumbling from the saddle while the other swerved away. Arrows hissed past me from Asha's position, one striking the post beside a rider's head, forcing him back. The fight was quick and sharp, the ground ringing with the clatter of hooves and the thud of boots as a few men tried to come in on foot. They didn't get far. Within minutes, they were pulling away, leaving two of their number on the ground and the rest fading into the dark. When the last sound of hooves was gone, the camp stayed quiet for a long moment, listening for any sign of return. Elias walked the line, speaking low to each man and woman who'd stood guard. When he reached me, his hand gripped my shoulder once before he moved on. Asha lowered her bow, her breathing still quick. "Not tonight," she said. I nodded, knowing what she meant. The following morning, the herd was restless, noses to the wind, as if they sensed what might still be out there. Caleb and I rode out to check the ridge where the riders had come down. We found fresh tracks cutting toward the south and a patch of trampled brush where they'd waited. "Could be they'll circle back," Caleb said, "or ride for easier ground." Either way, it meant they were still too close for comfort. Back in camp, Elias called a meeting by the central fire. "We've shown we can hold," he told the gathered circle. "But if they come again, it will be with more. We will not be here when they do." His plan was to move the camp west for a time, closer to allies and better ground for defense. It would mean breaking down lodges, packing what could be carried, and leaving behind anything that slowed us too much. The rest of the day was spent in motion. Women folded hides and stored dried food in woven sacks. Men repaired harnesses and oiled rifle parts. Asha and I worked to secure the wagon, checking the wheels and tightening every bolt and strap. She paused once, straightening from where she'd been binding a bundle. "When we move," she said, "you'll be at the front." "Near enough," I told her. She nodded, satisfied. By nightfall, most of the camp was ready for the trail. The fires burned lower than usual, and conversation was kept to a murmur. I walked the perimeter once more before bedding down the stars, sharp above the dark shape of the ridge. Somewhere out there, the men who had been testing our line were deciding their next move. The next morning broke cold and clear. Breath steamed from the horses as we hitched them. Elias gave the signal, and the camp began to roll west in a long, slow line. I rode alongside the wagon, Asha on horseback just behind her, eyes scanning the horizon. We moved steady every mile, putting more ground between us and the ridge. But I knew it wasn't the last time we'd see those riders. We made good time west, keeping the herd tight and the wagons close. Dust hung in the air behind us, rising in a long ribbon that could be seen for miles. The first night out, we camped in a shallow draw where cottonwoods broke the wind and water pooled in a narrow bend of the creek. It was quiet there, the sound of the current masking the occasional snort from the horses. By the second day, the ridgeline to our east had dropped from sight. We stopped at midday to rest the animals, the sun high and hard above us. Asha rode up beside my wagon, her horse breathing heavy from the pace. "Tracks," she said simply. "2 riders. Been shadowing since morning." Caleb joined us moments later, confirming her words. The prints were fresh, just far enough to keep out of rifle range, but close enough to watch us. That evening, Elias called for tighter order. Guards doubled on the perimeter, and the herd penned in the narrowest part of the draw. I took the west side with Caleb, while Asha stayed near the wagons. The night passed without trouble, but no one slept deep. On the morning of the third day, the trail opened onto rolling grassland. You could see for a mile in any direction, but that also meant anyone could see us. Around mid-morning, a rider appeared far off to the south, just a speck against the horizon. He stayed there pacing us until the land dipped enough to swallow him from view. We reached the planned meeting point that afternoon, a cluster of low bluffs with a spring tucked into the lee side. Waiting there were 6 men from a friendly band led by Thomas Gray, a wiry man in his 50s with eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Elias with a firm clasp and a nod toward the horizon. "We heard," he said. "They've been pressing folk all up and down this stretch. You'll be safer with us for a time." The 2 groups set camp together, wagons, forming a loose square with the animals inside. Supper was quick jerked meat flatbread and strong coffee. Just as the light began to fade, one of Thomas's men came in at a run. "Riders," he called. Dozen, maybe more, coming fast from the east. The camp moved without panic, but with purpose. Rifles were pulled from scabbards, and the gates to the animal pen were tied shut. Asha stood near me, arrow already notched her face, calm and steady. The riders came in hard, circling wide before pulling up short just beyond the bluff. Shouts carried on the wind, demanding Elias step out and speak. He did, moving to the edge of the square with Thomas beside him. The exchange was brief and bitter. They wanted the herd and any wagons they could take. Elias told them plain it wasn't theirs to have. One of the riders laughed and gave a signal, and the group broke in 2, half swinging wide toward the east flank, the rest charging straight at us. Gunfire cracked in quick succession. I fired twice, dropping one rider before he reached the bluff. Caleb's shot took another from his saddle. Asha's arrow found its mark in a man trying to climb the outer rock face. The fight was sharp and loud, the air thick with gun smoke and the smell of powder. In less than 10 minutes, they were pulling back, leaving 3 men on the ground and 1 horse limping after them. The rest rode hard east, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance. We stood still for a long moment, listening, waiting for any sign they might turn back. When it was clear they wouldn't, Elias gave the order to check the herd and tend the wounded. One of Thomas's men had taken a shot through the arm, but would live. We buried the dead where they fell, marking the graves with stones. That night, the campfire burned low. Conversation was scarce, each person turning over the day in their own mind. Asha sat beside me, hands resting on her knees, eyes on the dark horizon. "They'll come again," she said quietly. I nodded, knowing she was right. At dawn, Thomas and Elias met apart from the others. When they returned, the decision was made. We'd move again, deeper into Allied territory, where the ground favored defense and the trails were harder to follow. The journey would take 3 days if the weather held longer, if rain slowed us. Before breaking camp, I walked the perimeter one last time. The air was still the only sound, the creak of saddle leather, and the soft nicker of the horses. Somewhere out there, the men who had chased us across miles of open country were licking their wounds and planning. We rolled out just after sunrise, wagons in tight formation, riders flanking the herd on all sides. Every so often I caught Asha glancing toward the east, scanning the skyline for dust. The land ahead stretched wide and empty, but the feeling in my gut said the trail behind us wasn't done. By late afternoon, clouds began stacking in the west, their edges lit gold by the sinking sun. The wind carried the scent of rain. We made camp early, setting the wagons close and tying the animals under the shelter of a low ridge. As the first drops began to fall, I checked the rifle beside my bedroll and settled in, listening to the steady drumming on the canvas. It was the kind of night when sound travels far. Sometime past midnight, through the rain, I thought I heard the faint echo of hooves. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. We broke camp quickly, every eye still watching the eastern horizon. The faint sound of hooves I'd heard in the night hadn't returned, but no one trusted the quiet. By midday, the clouds gave way to a clear sky, and we reached the narrow pass Thomas had spoken of. The trail wound between two steep ridges, their rock faces rising like walls. Once through, the land opened to a sheltered basin, with a creek running cold and fast along its edge. Elias decided we'd stay there, close enough to water, high enough to see trouble coming. Over the next 2 days, we worked together, mending fences, setting lines for the horses, and digging a deeper channel to guide the creek's flow. Asha moved among us with quiet steadiness, teaching Thomas's men better ways to fortify the camp. Caleb and I took turns riding patrol, but no sign of the riders came. It was on the 4th morning that the dust rose again, a thin column against the horizon. This time we were ready. When the group approached, they slowed at the sight of our defenses. Rifles in place, wagons braced, and allies at our side. Elias stepped forward alone, but his voice carried. "You've taken your chance. You won't take another." The men wavered. After a long pause, they turned their horses and rode off without a word. The sound of their departure faded until only the wind moved through the grass. Life settled after that. The herd grazed easy, and the wagons stood in a neat line along the ridge. Evenings were spent around the fire, sharing bread and coffee, with the low hum of conversation filling the dark. Asha laughed more now, the hard lines in her face easing. Caleb talked of fixing up a small place near the creek where the soil was rich enough for planting. When the time came to move on, not everyone did. Some stayed to build in that sheltered basin, believing it could be more than just a camp. As we rolled out, I looked back once to see Asha standing beside the corral, a hand lifted in farewell. I knew we'd see her again. On the trail west, the land stretched wide and empty under the spring sun. The air smelled of promise. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight in my chest ease. Out here, justice wasn't always swift, but when it came, it had a way of settling deep, like rain soaking into dry ground. If you've ever found yourself fighting for your place in the world, you know it's not just about holding on. It's about knowing when you've built something worth staying for. And maybe out here on the edge of things, we'd done just that. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need it, and maybe keep riding along with me for the next one.